recording.
So, good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo. And this is part of the Evolution of Science Fiction webinar series. And we have one little treat today, another one coming, is Terry's been doing some interesting science fiction graphics. And I decided to put a few of them into the presentation today. And here's an opening one that Terry has done sometime over the last few weeks or month. That we'll use as a starting point. Terry's graphics are very complex and colorful and rich in detail, and strange and bizarre in ways too. So, right now we're up to module 17. The new millennium, the singularity, and beyond, the first decade. And this is part 2. Part 1 is available on our YouTube channel if you missed it. I refer to this module as the new millennium, the singularity, and beyond. And given the fact that the singularity, the technological singularity, is often seen as some point past which one can't, or humans don't have the capacity to conceptualize what could even happen after computers transcend human intelligence, it's going to be interesting to see how various science fiction writers, of which I will talk about a few today, actually present imaginative schemes that go beyond the singularity. And we're into the first decade, and as I said, and this is part 2 of it. Just in quick review, last time in part 1, we covered science fiction cinema in the first decade, including Avatar, The Cell, Minority Report. We talked about science fiction TV, including Battlestar Galactica and the evolution of the Sci-Fi Channel. I talked about some contemporary science fiction artists, talked about the various novels that won the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and British Science Fiction Awards during the first decade. And then I got into specific authors, beginning with Robert Sawyer and the Neanderthal Parallax. And we discussed alternate universes, cultural comparisons, consciousness, and the nature of the self. And then I spent some time talking about multicultural alternate reality science fiction, including Michael Chabon and Bacalalupe, which I'm probably mispronouncing, and 3 science fiction masterpieces. I call them masterpieces because they were all really excellent super novels of the 21st century by Ian MacDonald, River of Gods, and it takes place in future India, Brazil, which takes place in future and past Brazil, and The Dervish House, which takes place in future Istanbul. Now, today, we're going to be covering a number of new science fiction authors, which I've clustered together. If you count up, today we're going to hit on 14 different science fiction authors who flourished during the first decade of the 21st century. And I'm going to begin with science fiction authors who emphasize high-tech and computer culture, 3 in particular, Doctorow, Rajaniemi, and Charles Stross, highlighting Accelerando. Then we'll talk about another cluster of science fiction authors that, as best as I could cluster them together, deal with love, sex, death, art, demons, ghosts, and gods. Wilson Spin, Neil Gaiman, and American Gods and Graveyard Book, and then a surrealistic retelling of 2001 in Harrison's Light. Then we'll dive into space opera in the first decade, and I'm going to highlight 3 of the premier space opera writers of that first decade, McDivitt, Ian Banks, and Alistair Reynolds. Then I'm going to talk about noting three excellent women science fiction writers, Acero and her Quantum Rose, Elizabeth Moon and The Speed of Dark, and then a whole slew of novels by Connie Willis, often dealing with time travel. And then we'll conclude with China Miéville and the New Weird, in particular highlighting Perdido Street Station, The Scar, and Embassy Town. At the beginning today, I was having a bit of a conversation with Terry, and I realized that cats are going to play a significant role in several of these science fiction novels as we go through them. So be on the lookout for cats that come in many different forms, often being significantly involved in disrupting the space-time continuum. So that's an overview of today. And as I said, we're going to start with high-tech computer culture science fiction. And toward the end of the 20th century, and of course into the 21st century, there's been a lot of non-fiction writing that has come out dealing with the significance of technology, computer technology, robotics, the internet, virtual reality, and many, many popular books which have raised consciousness on the whole thing, including discussions about the technological singularity with Ray Kurzweil. If you recall in your science fiction history, the concept of technological singularity is usually identified with Venor Vinci back in the 1990s as being the person responsible for popularizing the idea. I have two quotes up here that I thought capture some of the anxiety and also some of the vision of all of this discussion that continues to go on up to today. The distinction between us and robots is going to disappear by Rodney Brooks, one of the great roboticists, inventors back over the last 20 years, and from Star Trek, from the Borg, resistance is futile. The machines are going to assimilate us, and there's no way around. So up here, there's a number of classic popular books that were written on technology and computers, pro and con, and on robots, and about the internet, and about the singularity. And this sort of captures the consciousness of that era, which we are still in, still worrying and wondering about it all. And in fact, all that thinking, of course, will stimulate science fiction, but I just put up a list here, which is continually evolving, of significant trends and predictions and possibilities. And science fiction writers get into a lot of this, and we'll talk about some of that today. The accelerative evolution of computer intelligence and the fear of general artificial intelligence, the accelerative evolution of the web and the internet. Sawyer covered that in his trilogy about the web becoming conscious and knowledge becoming integrated and available, and the emergence of some kind of cosmic mind out of it all. The accelerative evolution of mobile computer communication devices and interconnectivity. And we'll talk about that some today. One character, in fact, in Accelerando sort of brings that theme out significantly. Information technology spreading into everything, both in the world and in our bodies. And we're going to get into that quite a bit in quite a few novels today. The information age, as our jobs are transformed, then old jobs become obsolete. Our increasing dependency on AI and on the web, and intelligence technology enhancing human intelligence and our human capabilities. And that comes up in science fiction novels, of which many of them we'll talk today. The progressive immersion, and I call external infusion of virtual reality into our present reality, and the blurring of the distinction between fantasy and reality. The potential technological singularity, when computers become more intelligent than humans. And that definitely we will talk about today. On the negative side, stimulus information overload, too much stress and speed, the devolution of intelligence as we depend more on computers, and surveillance, transparency, loss of privacy, threats to our freedom and individuality. And that will come up as a theme that we will get into today in some of these science fiction novels and science fiction writers. Now, the first writer I'm going to bring up and talk about is Cory Doctorow. And Cory Doctorow is a journalist, a blogger. He was very significant in the blog and then turned into an electronic newsletter, Boing Boing. He actually still does writing and does editorials for Locus Magazine. He was a key contributor into the continued evolution of cyberpunk philosophy through Boing Boing, and has been a real advocate for human freedom and being very wary of the ways in which government and corporations, this is the theme in cyberpunk, can infringe upon our freedom, infringe upon our privacy. As one little treat today in our presentation, his first significant novel that he published that made a name for him and got nominated for the Nebula was Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. And just recently, my dear wife, Jeannie, read this novel per my recommendation and really enjoyed it. And I thought, as a bit of diversity in the talk today, I would ask Jeannie to do a little summary of the novel, which she is presently going to do. Now, this is his first published novel, really, really good novel. So I'm turning it over to Jeannie, and go to it, Jeannie.
Thank you, Tom. So I've been wanting to read this book for at least a decade, I think, since Tom first told me about it, and I was just really intrigued just by the title alone. And of course, we can all relate to the Magic Kingdom. It's such a big part of our culture. So this is just a really smart, funny, cool, sort of tongue-in-cheek, geeky look at our coming techno future. So the time is the future. It's probably at least 100 or 200 years out. And humanity has realized its most utopian dreams of this transhuman future. Death has been conquered. Immortality has been achieved through regular backups of yourself. And so if anything happens to you, if you get in an accident, or even if you just want to forget part of your recent past, you can just go back to your backup and revert to one of your earlier selves. And if you need a break, you can go offline. You can deadhead for 1,000 years and then just come back. So space in this kind of reality also is sort of this playground where if you want to break from your life on Earth, which he calls dirt side, you can sort of jet off to a low gravity bubble and just sort of cavort around there. And some of them, he has a lover there, an ex-lover named Zoya, who has a re-engineered body because she plays the piano. So she's got these long fingers, and they just sort of cavort and have a lot of sex and fly around naked and play their instruments. So it's just sort of this endless lost weekend of fun and fornication. Scarcity is also a thing of the past. There's no need for money, but money, that kind of currency has been replaced by a social currency called Wuffy. And so you're just constantly checking your status on Wuffy, which reminded me of one of those Dark Mirror episodes, which you can remind me of later, where everybody's checking their likes. Remember that one?
Yes.
Anyway, so in this reality is our protagonist, Julius, aka Jules, and he's a bit of an everyman, a little bit of an anti-hero, and he's still young, even though he's about a century old, although he looks maybe about 30, because you can sort of retain your youthfulness. And he's living his childhood dream of residing in Disney World in Florida. And Disney World in Florida is this, it's a place where still the long ago animatronic attractions are kept running by a dedicated group of what they call ad hocs. And he goes back to Disney World, and he's able to live there as a cast member. And his job is to increase the capacity. And he does this by shaving seconds off the ride time with little technical tweaks to it. And they call that the hourly throughput cap. But his dream to keep the attraction in sort of pure classic 20th century mode is threatened. And this threat is made clear when early on in the novel, he's shot dead at the tiki room. His head just gets blown off. So you have this murder sort of mystery. He is backed up, so he comes back, and he's just wondering who the hell would, murder him. So this threat is embodied by another character named Deborah. And Deborah, an apparent 20, even though she's probably been killed numerous times, because you can also be very reckless in this kind of reality. Anyway, she's a leader of this new group of ad hocs, and they are like super techno ad hocs. And they have just rehabbed the Pirates of the Caribbean with AI-driven Sims. And these Sims can communicate with each other. They can communicate with the guests. So it's making this whole experience of Disney World even more immediate. Well, she's taken over the Hall of Presidents, which is right near the Haunted Mansion. And Jules just has, he just wants to keep the Haunted Mansion the way it is. But Deborah's gaining more and more support for this idea. And she wants to replace these old animatronics with immersive direct-to-brain interfaces so that the guests will go through the attraction and have the actual experience of being Washington or Lincoln. Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, or Lincoln, with a background of a Civil War montage. So you can actually, taste the metallic flavor of bullets, and you can smell the gunpowder, and you can be Lincoln in this kind of new kind of techno facilitated attraction. And actually, Jules tries the demo at one point and of Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, and he says the effect, I staggered backwards. My head swam with flash-baked sense impressions, rich in detail. I knew on the spot that Deborah's Hall of Presidents was going to be a hit. And certainly it is. And so Deborah's social currency of whoopee just goes sky high. Okay, I've told I have to cut this short, and I am going to cut it short. In conclusion, it's just a really fun read. It's super engaging, and you also have this philosophical underlay where you really have to question the value of all of this technology and where our humanity lies in that. And character's really great. It's a sweet love story, it's a buddy story, and it's a murder mystery all wrapped in one. Lots of fun. Okay, Tom, I was almost done.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. Yes. Well, after Cory Doctorow wrote Down and Out of the Magic Kingdom, a few years later, he wrote Little Brother. And Little Brother became probably his most popular and award-winning novel in the near future, involving a group of teenagers who are very techno-savvy and get arrested as presumed terrorists, supposedly contributing to terrorist attacks in San Francisco. This is a very interesting book that delves into the technological capabilities of youth and how big business and big government is continually surveilling us and attempting to manipulate the news, and how this young group of techno-savvy teenagers in San Francisco outfoxes them. And this becomes a recurrent theme in a lot of Cory Doctorow's subsequent science fiction, of which I have 3 other novels that he wrote later on, of how we need to protect our individuality, we need to protect our freedom, and that there are various big forces out there attempting to manipulate our minds to control reality through technologies, but that but young minds, techno-savvy minds, can find ways around all of that and can buck the system. There's some elements of the old cyberpunk issue here of big pervasive forces manipulating and controlling our lives. But on Cory Doctorow's part, he finds ways in which, through his characters, to challenge the forces of surveillance and control of our minds, the control of our privacy, and control of our freedom. And that theme runs through all of these novels, beginning with Little Brother, which is a very interesting and engaging story, excellent characters, just like in Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. The final one by Cory Doctorow I'm going to mention is The Rapture of the Nerds, which he does a little bit later than these other ones. Actually, it comes about the same time as when he did the sequel to Little Brother and Homeland. But The Rapture of the Nerds he did together with Charles Stross, who I'm going to talk about a bit later on, as another high-tech science fiction writer. And The Rapture of the Nerds takes place about 100 years from now, and it occurs after the technological singularity, at which point humans have been able to download their minds, conscious minds, into a technological support system which is orbiting the Earth, and have achieved immortality in the process. And most people have decided to upload their minds into the computer system, which can support their full conscious identities. But some people still want to live the normal life without having to be inside of a computer. Now, the central character is one of those kind of resistant characters whose parents have gone up into the cloud, but he's still staying down on the earth. The funny thing, a philosophical thing about this novel is that the rapture is a Christian concept with the anticipation of one day being lifted up into heaven by God. But what happens in the novel is all the techno geeks are the ones, in a sense, who have been lifted up into the heaven of immortal consciousness embodied in our computer technology. And the bulk of the Christian population is still down on the earth, waiting for the, in quote, real rapture to occur, but have become increasingly frustrated because it isn't happening. And so the central character in here gets approached by Christian leaders asking if the Christians could now be uploaded into the cloud, having given up finally that God is going to come and ascend them into heaven. So the nerds in the end are the ones that provide the pathway into the rapture and immortality. Now, the singularity has already happened. We are using up incredible amounts of resources in order to support the singularity and all of these immortal conscious minds. And the twist at the end of the novel is that if we envision the singularity as being some pinnacle of ultimate evolution, what happens in the end is that the emergent techno-singularity of the Earth, with all of its superconscious minds, gets approached by the galactic authorities out there beyond us, informing us that we are using up resources too quickly and have to cool our jets. So even if we think we assume we have realized Godhead and we've achieved the ultimate in evolution, there's something out there that's even more powerful than us that's watching over us. So enough about Cory Doctorow. Now, Hannu Rajaniemi, the second high-tech author I'm going to mention here, is a young guy with he has a PhD in mathematical physics. He's Finnish. And the first novel he wrote, The Quantum Thief, which came out in 2010, is a really incredible high-tech science fiction achievement. Lots of people rate this as one of the best novels of the period, and I definitely would rate it that way too, because of how intricately imaginative this book is. It takes place in the distant future, I think somewhere around 2400 AD, and it takes place mostly on the planet Mars. And the central character is actually a virtual mind who has had many, many different lives. All those different lives have been stored in a giant computer system, which is controlled by this collective of billions of super intelligent minds who are dedicated to attempting to raise from the dead all conscious human minds that have ever existed. And he is facilitated in a prison break where his virtual mind gets out with the woman who you see on the cover there, who is his rescuer, and he's taken to Mars. And on Mars, there is a moving city, which is being moved along by various technological and human devices. And there is a detective, and there is this system where memories of everybody get shared and controlled. And I'm just beginning to tap the complexity and richness of this novel. It is a difficult novel to read. It is difficult to read because it is so intricately inventive. If one wants to get a very strange and mind-blowing vision of a future culture that has been infused with artificial intelligence, and humans are participating in that reality of artificial intelligence, then The Quantum Thief is a great, realistic, plausible vision of a very different, strange human reality with virtual minds, reincarnation, the manipulation of memory, and a giant collective manipulating the whole thing. And it was the first in a series of 3 novels, The Fractal Prince and The Causal Angel, by Rajaniemi. If you're up for something that will really challenge your technological intelligence and your imagination, I would definitely recommend The Quantum Thief as a great one to read. Now, the third writer, who's probably the science fiction writer of the first decade, most strongly associated with computer culture artificial intelligence science fiction is Charles Stross. Charles Stross early on wrote two post-singularity, after the singularity novels, Singularity Sky and Iron Sunrise, that came out early in that first decade. And something that immediately shows up with Charles Stross that he adds into the stew here, besides his technological imagination, is his sense of the comic. He is a funny writer. Singularity Sky, in between all of the technological inventiveness, is also a very funny novel to read, something we're going to encounter with other writers too. But after he wrote these two, he wrote his classic, memorable, extremely highly regarded, which lots of people, of course, have read, Accelerando. This is a quote from Gardner Dozois on Accelerando, which came out in 2005 and won the Locus Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. The Accelerando stories, they were written as a series of stories to begin with and then put into novel form, represent one of the most dazzling feats of sustained imagination in science fiction history, and radically ups the imagination ante for every other writer who wants to sit down at the future history table and credibly deal themselves into the game. And that's not a hyperbole. Accelerando is a feat of intelligence, imagination, technological realism of what the next century holds for us. It's written literally as a history of this coming century through the eyes of this one family, the Max family, 3 generations, and it traces their history through the next 100 years, beginning with Manfred, who is so dependent on his technological interfaces, his goggles, that if they are removed, then he becomes a totally incompetent individual. And what we do is we follow the Max family as computer intelligence eventually becomes more intelligent than humans, and then astronomically quickly, in an accelerated fashion, passes us by. And humans eventually refer to the technological intelligence that are superhuman as the vile offspring. And again, Stross gets rather comical with a lot of this. We find in here lobster mines, and we find the Queen of Jupiter, who flies around in a spaceship the size of a Coca-Cola can. We find a manipulative artificial intelligence chat, okay? We find the entire solar system being dismantled and turned into a giant matryoshka brain of layers and layers of computronium that are in this vast computation. And we've discovered that the universe is filled with these matryoshka brains all over the place. And we find humanity hightailing it out of the solar system as the vile offspring gets increasingly more powerful and powerful. When I read Accelerando, which comes from the Italian to mean speeding up, I thought that Charles Stross probably wrote this novel on speed, because you feel you're on speed. You feel you're accelerating as you read through this novel. It has a visceral impact on you. The accelerated evolution of technology infusing into human life, that feeling of it definitely comes through in Accelerando. And this I would recommend as, being one of the great novels written in the first decade of the 21st century in science fiction. Stross wrote a number of other novels later on that are often post-singularity: Glass House, Halting State, Saturn's Children, that are also very good. They don't, I don't think, hold up to the quality of Accelerando, and then got off into writing rather occult, magical kinds of science fiction, the Laundry Files novels, and the Apocalypse Codex actually won the Hugo, not the Hugo, the Locust one year for being best novel of the year. But his great achievement in the 21st century science fiction was writing Accelerando. So if you haven't read Accelerando, and some of you have and some of you haven't, I would definitely recommend reading it as a very realistic and very visceral and very high-tech history of the 21st century, plausible history of the 21st century. Now let's turn to Love, Sex, and Murder, Death, Demons, and Gods. And three authors I'm going to highlight here, beginning with Robert Charles Wilson. And Robert Charles Wilson wrote a number of very good novels, science fiction novels, in this first decade of the 21st century, beginning with Darwinia and the Chronicled. Let me just, and these novels were nominated for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. Just say a couple words about Darwinia, which I really liked. Definitely was a very interesting novel in which the miracle occurs on the planet Earth, and half of the people, fauna, geology, and flora of the Earth disappear and are replaced by this totally different geography with totally different plants and animals that seem to be alien in their nature. And it's the story of this one character from the United States journeying into this alien land, which has been called Darwinia, to see what this all means, because this is some kind of great mystery that how did this happen? What does it all mean? And he eventually makes contact with this collective of computer-like minds that is attempting to save consciousness in the universe. So it's a very interesting novel combining different elements together. And it's a novel that I would recommend. But his really great novel was Spin. And Spin, I describe to people as a love story that lasts billions of years. Spin begins with these three young children sitting outside, looking up at the sky, at the stars, and all the stars all of a sudden disappear. Spin won the Hugo for Best Novel of the Year when it came out, and the story involves figuring out, attempting to understand what has happened here such that all the stars have disappeared. And what's eventually discovered is that this membrane has been placed around the Earth by powers unknown. And inside of the membrane on the Earth, for every year that passes on the Earth, 1,000,000 years pass out there in the universe. So the story literally takes place over billions of years. Actually, I got that wrong. It's not 1,000,000 years, it's 100 million years. So every year on the Earth is equal to 100 million years out there in the rest of the universe. And the story involves humanity trying to figure out what this is all about, why this has happened. And in the middle of this is this love story that literally takes place over billions of years universe time between these two of the young people who first observed the stars going out. Now, I would rate this as one of the 3 or 4 best science fiction novels of the decade. I'd rate it an equal par to Accelerando. And one of its strongest elements, it is so beautifully written. This is a novel written by a poet. Robert Charles Wilson is so lyrical, so fluid, so colorful in his description of cosmic events, of personal events, and tying the whole thing together. That Spin definitely is one of the best of this decade, in my opinion. Now, he would write other things such as sequels to Spin and Julian Comstock, A History of 22nd Century America, in which Christianity has taken over the government of the United States, but how we end up with a homosexual or gay president in the end. But Spin was his great achievement that came out in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. So we have love in the cosmos, and that's what this is. Spin is love in the cosmos. Now, the second key writer here under this general category I'm going to mention is Neil Gaiman. Now, Neil Gaiman could be thought of as a fantasy writer, but his stuff kind of often blurs the distinction between fantasy and science fiction. Neil Gaiman, from early on in his life, was an avid reader of science fiction, but also of comic books, and started his writing career in comics, but became associated with Alan Moore, who did Watchmen, and then became connected up with DC Comics and made his name with the Sandman, or the Sandman series, which are very colorful, mystical, graphic novel, comic kinds of stories, and actually have been listed as one of the 100 best reads of the last few decades, and was on the New York Times bestseller list. And in fact, Neil Gaiman has turned into one of the most awarded science fiction and fantasy writers of contemporary times. He's written lots of books that have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have often been put into cinema form. In fact, just recently, Amazon Prime did a series on his book, Good Omens, which he co-wrote with Terry Pratchett. And Good Omens is an interesting comical retelling of the apocalypse, where we're going to have the Battle of Armageddon and the Antichrist is coming, but an angel and a demon decide they don't like the idea and they want to prevent the Battle of Armageddon and the apocalypse. And he wrote other ones that, besides that achieved great popularity. But then he won the Hugo and the Nebula and the Locus Awards, all 3, when he published American Gods. And American Gods, although you could see it as fantasy, is obviously it's a metaphorical fantasy, because it deals with this theme, this general theme of who are the gods of humanity? Who do we worship in personified form? And what were the old gods like? And then what are our new gods like? And the story involves this journey, this saga across the United States with a mysterious character called Mr. Wednesday, and Shadow, who is an ex-convict, and this continual encounter and adventure dealing with both ancient gods like Odin and Easter and Thoth and Loki, and new gods like World Mind, which is the god of globalization and media, and a conflict between the old gods and the new American gods taking place on this rambling adventure across the United States. And it's an entertaining read. I wouldn't say it was one of the best things of the first decade, but it definitely has a lot of color in it and a lot of different characters. And it did win the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locust when it came out. He also wrote Coraline, which they turned into a movie. American Gods, in fact, they've done on TV now. Coraline, they turned into a movie about a young girl who goes through this door and finds a duplicate reality with a duplicate mother and father. Very good novel. Very good novel. It's a short novel, but very interesting. And then most recently, he won the another Hugo for Best Novel of the Year for The Graveyard Book, about a baby who wanders into a cemetery and communicates with the ghosts in the cemetery and is being pursued by this character who wants to murder the baby. And we watch the baby turn into a boy and grow up, and the boy encounter witches and ghouls and strange underground creatures. It's a very colorful, entertaining novel. And again, he won awards for that too. So you wouldn't necessarily call Gaiman strictly science fiction, but he sort of is on the borderline between them. And he has won an incredible number of science fiction and fantasy awards for his work. And you should mention him when you were doing a history of science fiction in the 20th century. A very imaginative, colorful, accomplished writer of the last 20 years, and one of the most awarded writers of the last 20 years in science fiction and fantasy. And now we're going to come to an interesting character, N. John Harrison. And Harrison is English. Harrison early on was one of the editors for Michael Moorcock in New Worlds, which I had talked about as being a significant new wave science fiction magazine back in the 1960s and 70s. And Harrison's writing career goes way, way back, in fact, to the 1970s. And China Mieville, who we are going to talk about a little bit later, has said of Harrison that John Harrison is not a Nobel laureate, proves the bankruptcy of the literary establishment. Austere, unflinching, and desperately moving, he is one of the very great writers alive today. And yes, he writes fantasy and science fiction, though of a form, scale, and brilliance that it shames not only the rest of the field, but most of modern fiction. Ian Banks, who we're also going to talk about, says that Harrison is a Zen master of prose. When Harrison first started writing back in the 1970s, he wrote space opera science fiction like The Centauri Device. He wrote a series of novels dealing with a mythical city in the far future called Veraconium, which are similar in nature to Jack Vance's far future science fiction, mixing together distant future times with medieval settings and high technology. But then he wrote other interesting things that had nothing to do with science fiction, like a book on climbing, The Climbers, which The Guardian magazine says it is surely the best novel about rock climbing ever written. And it's sort of semi-autobiographical. This is written back in the 1980s. And then, in fact, he wrote fantasy novels about cats, including The Wild Road. Now, this is all over the decades preceding the beginning of the 21st century. But in 2002, he began a trilogy, Light, Nova Swing, Light, Nova Swing, and Empty Space. And the science fiction chronicles, this trilogy is usually referred to as the Kefahuchi Track Trilogy, refers to it as, stands as the single most significant work of science fiction in the 21st century. Now, I don't know if I would say that, but beginning with Light, we have an exceedingly different and bizarre, if that's the right word, kind of science fiction being written here. Light is a surrealistic retelling of 2001. It involves three characters, three different timelines, one present, two 400 years, the other two characters 400 years in the future. The first timeline is J.G. Ballard New Wave in style. It involves a man who is obsessed in present day with what he thinks is this demon-like creature following him, which has driven him mad, that he keeps running from, and he has become an obsessive murderer as a consequence of being haunted by this strange being who appears to him having the look of the skull of a horse on its head. The second timeline is of a woman in the 24th century who decides when she is very young that she is going to transform her body and mind to integrate together with a spaceship. And so she, in fact, as a character and central narrator in the second timeline, is an intelligent spaceship talking to us about its experiences. Her consciousness, her personal identity being embodied in the spaceship. So the second timeline is space opera. The third timeline is about a character who has become addicted to virtual reality, masturbates to it all the time, is a addict, derelict character who gets drawn into this strange interaction with murderers and thieves and fucks all these different women all over the place. And that's a cyberpunk novel. So we have these three separate timelines moving along. And what gets revealed through all of this is that this haunting character in track one is actually this super intelligent alien who's responsible for the evolution of humanity and is trying to get us to pass into this mysterious realm which the alien species of millions of years ago wasn't able to do. And I'm only scratching the surface with it. Light is a very bizarre, stylistic, complex, poetical, at times rather nasty novel. And is highly regarded by lots of people as one of the best things written in the 21st century in science fiction. Oh, and I forgot to mention the fact that there are two cats in it, a white cat and a black cat, who are friends with the character from the 20th century and are the first to realize that aliens are trying to communicate with us and are responsible for the discovery of faster than light speed. And the girl names her spaceship Black Cat, and she becomes, in a sense, Black Cat. And the drug addict at the end names his spaceship White Cat. And there's more to come on that. So light is a trip. That's the best way to describe it. It's not for the easy of stomach or easy sensitivities, because there's a good deal of violence in it, but there's also a good deal of surrealistic, dreamlike reality. And in the end, aliens are responsible for evolution and for trying to help us move to the next level. Okay, so now let's go into space opera, and I'll just do one author in space opera before we take a little break here. And I just want to begin with Jack McDevitt. Jack McDevitt's an American writer. This is a painting by Bob Eagleton, which I described as one of the great science fiction artists of the last few decades. And it's the cover from The Engines of God by Jack McDevitt, which was one of his earliest novels. And Jack McDevitt, who's from Georgia, has been referred to as the logical heir to Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke by Stephen King. And McDevitt has this interesting distinction of having had 12 of his novels nominated over the last 15 years for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year, Nebulas. But he only won once, but he's had 12 nominated. And his novels take place primarily in outer space, take place primarily in the future. The Engines of God, which is an early one in his space operas, was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and introduces one of his two central characters. That's another thing about McDevitt. He has two main characters who keep popping up through all of his novels. One of them is a space pilot captain named Priscilla Hutchins, and the other is a far future archaeologist named Alex Benedict. And The Engines of God, which occurred early on among this whole series of novels, involves us discovering out in the 23rd century, when Priscilla Hutchins lives, that some ancient species have left these incredible monoliths, statues throughout the local parts of our galaxy, but the species seems to have disappeared. And humanity's in search of trying to figure out what all of these monoliths mean, and who created them. And that's something that frequently comes up in Jack McDevitt's novels, is that they're kind of like science fiction mysteries. There's a puzzle presented at the beginning, and then you have to try to figure out, well, what's really going on here? In Ancient Shores, which is an early one that I thought was very interesting, people in North Dakota discovered this super high-tech sailboat buried in the ground in the middle of North Dakota. And as it turns out, 100,000 years ago, there was a giant lake in the area where the boat is discovered. And it turns out that the sailboat was an alien sailboat, and they find a portal into other worlds, but the whole thing is on an Indian reservation, and the U.S. government wants to come in and take the whole thing over, and the Indians and the U.S. government get into a confrontation where the white man is attempting again to steal the indigenous Americans' territory for its own purposes. This is a very good novel, and it not only has science fiction elements, it also has a good deal of political commentary. Eternity Road takes place in the future United States. This one wasn't a space opera, in which human civilization is being destroyed, and somebody finds a book written by Mark Twain and goes on this journey across the United States looking for the library that the book was from. Chindi, which is a space opera, involves humanity discovering this giant spaceship that turns out to be a museum that travels across the galaxy, collecting data and artifacts from all the different systems that it visits. And it's another mystery, and it's got some interesting elements in it, like werewolves, and everybody can watch their movies of their whole life, which have been collected inside Chindi, which means spirit of the night. The one he won his best novel of the year for was Seeker, which involves a spaceship 10,000 years in the future that disappears, and they try to search the spaceship down. One thing about Jack McDivitt I should mention is that if you like good narratives that are easy to read, that flow, he's a good writer. They're not necessarily colossally imaginative and cosmic, but he's a very easy author to read, and he keeps getting nominated for Best Science Fiction Novels of the Year. So that's probably a good place to take a little 5-minute break, and we'll stop at the moment and talk about the other space opera authors in a bit here, but let's just take a little break. We had just been talking about Jack McDivitt and his multiple Nebula nominee novels, and I had just highlighted a few, and we're talking about space opera in the first decade of the 21st century. So at this point, I'm going to come to Alastair Reynolds. The spaceship up there on this next slide is the nostalgia for infinity. And this spaceship has 1,000 levels on it, 1,000 levels. And that's going to be a significant fixture in the first novel we're going to discuss. Alastair Reynolds is from Wales. He's got a PhD in astrophysics. He worked for the European Space Research and Technology Center. Eventually, he has become now a full-time science fiction writer. Two of his stories, which I just recently discovered, Zima Blue and Beyond the Aquila Rift, were actually adapted into the Netflix animated series, Love, Death, and Robots. And if you get Netflix, you could see two of his stories done in animated form on Netflix. One of the really entertaining science fiction websites, Media Death Cult, and I know the name sounds strange, but Media Death Cult, you could look it up. The character who does it does lists of best science fiction novels and his favorite this and his favorite that in science fiction, and he's very good, very intelligent, but very engaging. Lists two of Alastair Reynolds' novels as two of the 10 best science fiction novels ever. And we'll talk about those two novels. The first that he lists is where the nostalgia for infinity occurs, and that is Alastair Reynolds' first novel, Revelation Space. Revelation Space is grand space opera. One of the ones I would pick, I would recommend to you, read it from this decade. An incredible piece of imagination and intelligence. Takes place in the 25th century, out in space. It provides an answer to Fermi's paradox, which is, given the probability of intelligence evolving in the galaxy across the universe, why is it we see no indications of it up there? And Revelation Space provides an answer to that. Not that other science fiction novels haven't as well. And it is based on the idea that billions of years ago, there were in fact millions of intelligent civilizations existing out there in outer space. But in a madness of war and competition, almost all of the ancient alien civilizations destroyed each other until one particular civilization decided it would put an end to the whole thing by creating this super intelligent AI that would monitor the state of the Milky Way. And anytime an intelligent species began to show space traveling capabilities, it would wipe it out. And the reason why we don't see anything is because the inhibitors, which are machines, a machine intelligence that has existed for billions of years, keeps eliminating any candidate toward a space civilization. This novel takes place in the 25th century, in which we have an individual central character here who is digging up this relics of an ancient civilization, and he gets arrested because he's disobeying the orders of the government, who is funding and controlling this archaeological dig. And while he is being incarcerated, we have this assassin who lives on Chasm City, who gets hired by this half human, half machine to assassinate this archaeologist for reasons unknown. And there's a third storyline. We have this gigantic spaceship, Nostalgia for Infinity, that is traveling to try to find the archaeologist, because this archaeologist has the ability to cure its captain, who is dying from this nanotech plague on this spaceship. These storylines eventually all interweave together, through which we finally do discover that aliens have populated the entire Milky Way until they all destroyed each other, and now we can't ever get anything going because the ultimate machine intelligence governing or watching over everybody here will end up destroying us if we start going out into space. But as it turns out, this machine is beginning to decay, this super intelligent machine watching everything. And there's numerous interesting characters in here. There's numerous technologically inventive ideas, super weaponry, planet-sized brains, virtual minds that infect machines, clones of clones, experiments in immortality. The list goes on and on and on. And what does revelation space mean? It means that there's some area out there in the universe which has just been discovered, which has in it the secrets and wonders of the entire history of things as they have transpired in the Milky Way. And this one character has dove into it, but come out possessed by an ancient alien mind. So I know that sounds a bit complex and wiggling around all over the place, but it's just a really, really great novel, a fantastic imagination, in particular, fantastic technological imagination. And it does provide an answer to Fermi's paradox, but Alastair Reynolds, you could include him also as being one of the significant science fiction writers regarding artificial intelligence and computer intelligence, although I'm putting him over here with space opera, because his stuff takes place in outer space. But it's at a real cosmic level of speculation with super high tech and interesting characters along the way. The year after he wrote Revelation Space, he wrote Chasm City, that takes place on the city where the assassin was at the beginning of Revelation Space. And we have a city that literally grows as animated and has become infected with the nanoplague that eventually got the captain of the Nostalgia for Infinity. So the two stories interrelate together. And after that, he wrote sequels to Revelation Space, Redemption Arc, and Absolution Gap. A lot of his short story stuff got collected, short story stuff dealing with the Revelation Space series. He's actually, I think, wrote around 8 or 9 novels now in the series. The pivotal one, the one that he's best remembered for in the whole series, is the first one. And as a first novel for a science fiction writer, it's a real achievement. And I would definitely say it's one of the 10 best novels of the decade, Revelation Space. But not to be outdone, a few years later, after that, he wrote House of Suns. Now, House of Suns, the guy that's on Media Cult website rates House of Suns as the best science fiction novel ever written. That's his opinion. I would not rate it as high as that, but I would put it in the top 30 or 40, something like that, at least that. But the guy in Media Cult says this is the best thing ever written. And the guy in Media Cult really likes big science fiction with great cosmic concepts. And the House of Suns takes place between the 31st century, which is obviously 1,000 years from now, and runs out 6 million years into the future. Okay, so big time span. Second thing, humans have become fundamentally immortal. Humans no longer live on planets, but live in spaceships. And humans are a whole set of different families of genetic clones. The central characters in the novel are all clones of one woman, and they are members of the House of Flowers. And the House of Flowers has reunions every 200,000 years. And in the interim, they travel around the Milky Way, making one loop every 200,000 years to observe what's going on and to just watch over things and gather knowledge and study the cosmos. And when they're coming back for their next reunion, almost all of them are murdered. And the story revolves around who's committed this murder of these immortals. And there are very fascinating robots in here. The Andromeda Galaxy disappears along the way. And it turns out that there's this mysterious other group of clones called the House of Suns that is responsible for this mass assassination. So this is big picture science fiction, great cosmic scale, definitely another really top-notch space opera of the 20th century, 21st century. And Alastair Reynolds is one of the best space opera, contemporary space opera writers, if for no other reason for Revelation Space and House of Suns. He's collected even further short stories in Beyond the Aquila Rift, which, as I mentioned, they did into a video on TV. And he's actually collaborated with Stephen Baxter, who I talked about earlier, who's one of the other contemporary great cosmic space opera writers. And the two of them together did a sequel, a novel to Arthur C. Clarke's A Meeting with Medusa. And that's of a more recent time. But the two that I'm highlighting here that really are both excellent are House of Suns and Revelation Space. And now we'll come to what I think is the best space opera of the first decade of the 21st century by Iain M. Banks. And Iain M. Banks is listed as one of the 50 greatest British writers of the last 50 years. The Times calls him the most imaginative novelist of his generation. He's from Scotland. Interestingly, he has wrote just as many non-science fiction novels as science fiction novels. When he writes science fiction, he refers to himself as Ian M. Banks. When he writes non-science fiction novels, he's just Ian Banks. And he tried when he was a young to publish science fiction, and he couldn't get any of his early novels accepted. So he eventually wrote a fictional novel that was non-science fiction called The Wasp Factory. And it was described by the Irish Times as a work of unparalleled depravity. He became world famous for this novel about a psychopathic kid who lives on an island, who is able to control wasps and use them for nefarious purposes, but it got him out into the public eye. Once he started to have this visible career and make a name for himself, he started to publish science fiction. And he is known for creating this series of science fiction novels. I think there's 9 of them, called the culture novels. And what his vision is in the culture novels, and their space operas, is that in some indeterminable time in our galaxy, a civilization arises that achieves such a level of technological development that they no longer live on planets, they live in spaceships, they are all technologically super enhanced, they have a variety of technological robotic support systems. They don't have to work, and they watch over the rest of the Milky Way and interact with developing species throughout the Milky Way. And the series began with Consider Phlebas, and the next ones that came out, The Player of Games and Use of Weapons. These became a very popular series, science fiction series, and I will come to the one in particular I want to highlight. He also wrote some other science fiction that by then that started to attract attention, Fearsome Engine and The Algebraists. And The Algebraists was nominated for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year, and it's not part of the Culture series, but it definitely was one of his best novels, and it's one of his best novels because it has this unique, imaginative format. Scattered throughout our galaxy are innumerable gas giant planets. Now let's imagine that intelligence could evolve in gas giants. What would it be like living in a world that's not a two-dimensional surface on which action takes place, but a three-dimensional depth where the species, the intelligent species, can not only move forward, backward this way, but moves up and down, so creates cities that are three-dimensional in form. The novel takes place about 4000 AD. The Milky Way is populated with these gas giant civilizations. The creatures who live in these gas giant civilizations are like giant floating jellyfish or octopus. They are crazy and entertaining and comical as hell. Humans have to interact with them to solve a mystery. These aliens are slow beings. They emerged billions of years ago, and their lives will last millions of years. And we're very fast. In fact, we're called a quick species from their point of view, and they're seen as slow species from our point of view. So there's this interaction that goes on between humans in the future and these strange three-dimensional like beings that are very comical. That's the right way to describe them. They're disorganized. They engage in games that involve killing. They think we're really stupid. We think they're barbaric. And it's an interesting mesh between humans and between a different kind of alien species. I would recommend that. You know, it's a lot of people think it's a very good novel, especially for the depiction of the giant jellyfish-like aliens. I know that sounds kind of silly, but it is very good. But the one that I think is his best, and the one that I would rate as the best space opera of the first decade, is Matter, and this is part of the Culture series. And I would rate it as the best because, first of all, let's put it in the context of the culture, civilization of this future reality with super enhanced humans. And in our galaxy, there are these shell worlds. And these worlds were created by some alien species long, long ago, which has disappeared. And shell worlds are these worlds constructed where there are multiple layers to the world. So different civilizations can exist on different layers, concentric worlds, one around another. And the story takes place on one of these shell worlds where the king on one of the levels has been assassinated, and the prince, the son of the king, is on the run, but his sister is a member of the culture, and his sister has incredible technological powers. And there's a species existing on this shell world that's obsessed with digging up the relics of its ancestors, and what it digs up is this super destructive artificial intelligence that was created by destroyers of the cell worlds, and sets sail toward the center of the shell world to kill the world god who exists in the middle of it. This is a very intricate but very visualizable strange reality with these concentric worlds, with medieval humans living on them, with super intelligent, cultured, technologically sophisticated beings, with this chase toward the center of one of these worlds to try to destroy this artificial intelligence. Very, very well done. Very well done. And I definitely put that in my top 20 best science fiction, 25 science fiction novels ever. Matter by Ian Banks. He continued to write more in the Culture series. Sad is that Ian Banks, when he was relatively young, developed cancer and died from it back about, I think, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, exactly. But while he was alive, he wrote really great space operas, really great science fiction. And I would definitely recommend Matter if you've never read anything by Ian Banks. So now let's turn to some women science fiction writers. I'm going to highlight three. First one is Catherine Acero. Now, she really goes against multiple stereotypes. Look at the picture she decides to take of herself. This lady has a PhD in chemical physics. She's a math teacher and a chemistry teacher, but she's also an accomplished jazz dancer and ballet dancer. She was president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America for 4 years, 2 years, something like that. Okay. She also is a rock musician. And she's the daughter of Frank Acero, who is the man who discovered the iridium layer in the Earth's geological stratum, which led to the formulation of the comet destroying the dinosaurs. So her father is a top-notch world scientist, and she pursued a career in science and then ended up writing science fiction. But she's a dancer, she's a rock musician, and a bunch of other things that I'm not even going to get into. And she, she looks like she belongs in a band like Fleetwood Mac or something. She is another one who's done a whole series dealing with a long-term saga, and it's called The Saga of the Skolian Empire. And here's some of the earlier novels in it. In 2003, no, 2001, I'm sorry, 2001, she won the Nebula for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year for her novel, The Quantum Rose. And the Skolian Empire series, of which The Quantum Rose is part of, is based on the idea that thousands upon thousands of years ago, aliens came to the Earth and abducted a large population of Mayans and brought them out into outer space and then just left them there. And the Mayans eventually evolved into a space-faring civilization called the Ruby Dynasty. Then they fell apart, disintegrated as a civilization, and then started to reorganize themselves into a civilization that exists in our time around 2200 AD. And the story takes place on one of the planets that humans live on, of which there are 1,000 worlds out there that have been settled already by humans that we don't know anything about. And it takes place on this kind of psychedelic world where we have a woman who has been betrothed to this evil character, and this new guy enters town, and I use that word loosely, who offers this immense amount of money to buy a marriage to this woman, but shows up at the wedding drunk. And that's just sort of the beginning of it. I can go on through the whole story, but it's a romantic science fiction novel. Lots of sex in it, really bad guys and good guys, people who read minds. The Quantum Rose is the name of the woman, and the whole novel is modeled on quantum mechanics, and you could read about it at the end of it. And it's a rather entertaining story when all is said and done. But she won Best Science Fiction Novel for the Nebula in 2001. Now, the second woman I'm going to discuss is Elizabeth Moon. And Elizabeth Moon is another interesting character because Elizabeth Moon is an ex-Marine. And early on in her career, she wrote fantasy. She got nominated for a Nebula. Then she started writing military science fiction, and she wrote a whole series of military science fiction novels, and wrote some together with Anne McCaffrey. But Elizabeth Moon had an autistic son, and in 2003, she published The Speed of Dark. And this, I would say, was one of the best novels of the decade, for sure, because it's a story set in the near future about an autistic adult male who works in this computer information company, is a functioning autistic adult, and is offered the opportunity for his autism to be cured. Because in this future world, we've developed a way to eliminate autism in the womb, but we hadn't developed a way until this happens in the story to correct it in an adult. And the whole issue of the novel is whether Lou, who is this autistic adult and functioning fairly well, wants to become, in quote, normal. And it is described, the whole novel, from Lu's point of view, which is from the point of view of a totally different kind of a mind than us. And like I've said, you could have alien minds, which are different kinds of minds, but here we have a human mind, but a human mind in a lot of ways that is very different from our kind of mind. You become very sympathetic with Lu. Lu has to debate the whole thing out. It turns out Lu is very intelligent and can learn things very quickly, can study neuroscience books if he has to, has an enemy out there who he doesn't know who it is and can't conceptualize how anybody could be his enemy. And his boss wants him to agree to this experiment, this treatment, and you follow Lu as he debates and thinks out and speculates on this whole thing about becoming normal and not being the way he is, and will he lose his identity? And intermittently through the novel, he keeps asking himself the question, what is the speed of dark? And he thinks that's a significant question, that it makes sense. And it's a kind of metaphor on the fact that this question makes sense to him and to us when we think about it. What do you mean, the speed of dark? He says it's the speed of light. Why can't there be a speed of dark? But highly recommended. Great psychological science fiction, not a lot of technology, but a different kind of consciousness, a different kind of mind, given the opportunity to become normal. And what does he do at the end? And I'm not going to tell you what he does at the end, in case you haven't read it. Now, finally, we come to the premier woman science fiction writer of the last 20, 30 years, Connie Willis. And Connie Willis has written an incredible number of Hugo and Nebula and Locus Award-winning novels and stories. A lot of them deal with time travel, deal with the flow of history. And she has actually won combined more Hugos and Nebulas, 18 of them, than any other science fiction writer ever. She's a member of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. She's a Grand Master of science fiction. And when she started out writing, and she actually started publishing back in the 1980s, her first stuff came out in the early 1980s. A lot of it got collected in these two books, Firewatch and Impossible Things. Early on in her short stories, which won awards, she brought in this idea of a group of historians who live around 2060 AD, having developed time travel, going back and observing events in history as time travelers. Firewatch was the first one that occurs in as a short story where a man goes back in time to the 1940s in London and he's doing it as part of his history practicum. And something comes out in Firewatch, first time she won a Hugo or Nebula, both in fact for that story, is Connie Willis has this incredible sense of humor. She is perhaps the funniest of all science fiction writers. And her stuff is very good stories, very good characters, but there's incredible humor in them. And early on, her stories got collected in Firewatch and Impossible Things. Since I want to sort of flow along here at a decent pace, just let me mention one other one she wrote that didn't have to do with time travel that I found very, very funny, hilarious, which was even the Queen. And can you imagine writing a hilarious, philosophical, socially astute science fiction novel about women's periods, which is even the Queen, about a woman who wants to join the cyclists as a young girl, a young teenager, and her grandmother gets all upset about it, and you're wondering what the cyclist is, and it turns out the cyclists are people who want to keep their cycle going because women have achieved liberation with some kind of medical treatment where women do not have their monthly cycles. And it's a very funny story, very, very good. But she really achieved, and then she wrote a novel about a man who keeps having dreams that seem to be dreams of Robert E. Lee, Lincoln's dreams. But then where she really achieved great fame was with Doomsday Book. And Doomsday Book is a time travel story, the Oxford historians again. And in Doomsday Book, we have a woman who has been trained in the customs and language of medieval Europe, and they intend to send her back to 1320 AD, which is about 20 years before the plague really spreads across Europe, and something goes wrong with the time machine, and she is thrown right into the beginnings of the plague in Europe. But when she gets there, she starts to get really sick, and the people back in 2060, a lot of them start to get sick too. And so we have these two timelines going on, with a woman stranded in 14th century England, sick and not able to communicate, and a plague breaking out in the 21st century in England. And they can't seem to figure out what has gone wrong with the time machine. And it's a very in-depth look at both the customs and the people of the 14th century as the plague begins to spread across England and spreads into this village, this woman struggling to figure out where she is and how she can get back to the present, and this plague spreading in 21st century England, and how is it connected to the plague back there in the 14th century? And the modern timeline is hilarious, just absolutely hilarious. Can you make a plague spreading across a modern city something funny? Well, you can, and Connie Willis did it. The storyline of the medieval period is not so funny, but the storyline of the 21st century definitely is. But then she exceeded herself with To Say Nothing of the Dog. This also won the Hugo for Best Novel of the Year. And To Say Nothing of the Dog has as its subtitle, Or How We Found the Bishop's Bird Stump at Last. The title is taken from a book written back in the 19th century called Three Men in a Boat to Say Nothing of the Dog. And it's a time travel story, again, with our Oxford historians. And this central character is being sent around through time to try to find the bishop's bird stump, which is needed to complete a recreation of a cathedral in 21st century England. But he's suffering from time lag. He's really worn out. He gets sent back to the 19th century in order to carry an object with him that was brought from the 19th century into the 21st century, which could upset the whole flow of time. And the object that has been not accidentally, but the object that has been brought forward in time that has to be returned to the 19th century is what? A cat. And the cat was taken by another time traveler, where the cat was just about ready to drown and was brought forward and is disrupting things and has got to be taken back. But it's a hilarious novel, one thing going wrong after another, while through the whole thing is this ongoing deep philosophical discussion of the nature of history, historical determinism, whether people shape history or forces shape history. So there's lots of intelligence and character study involved in the novel, as well as it being this series of misfortunes and mayhems that go on till finally at the end, they do find the bishop's bird stump and they do get the cat back to the 19th century. I'm having these beep, beep, beeps, whichever that is. Connie Willis went again for passage where we have a psychologist who's studying near-death experiences and tries to figure out what near-death experiences are. Then she won again with Blackout All Clear, which is another time travel a novel, in fact, two novels, an immense piece of work with a bunch of historians that go back to 1940s during the World War II. And when it was asked what this is all about, I'm going to go a little bit over, about 10 minutes today, probably. She said, and this again, it won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locust for Best Novel of the Year. She said, the novels are about Dunkirk and ration books and D-Day and V-1 rockets, about tube shelters in Bletchley Park and gas masks and turret pumps and Christmas pantomimes and cows and crossword puzzles and the Deception Campaign, and mostly the books about all the people who did their bit to save the world from Hitler. Shakespearean actors and ambulance drivers and vicars and landladies and nurses and wrens and RAF pilots and Winston Churchill and General Patton and Agatha Christie, heroes all. Jeannie has read this and really loved it. And as I mentioned, won all three major awards. 2010, all of her short fiction is collected together in Time is the Fire, from the quote, time is the fire in which we burn. And she has a new book coming out very soon called The Road to Roswell, about a lady who goes to a UFO convention in Roswell, New Mexico, and gets abducted by an alien. It looks like it's going to be another funny one. Now we'll come to the last writer here, and I'm sorry I'm going to rush through him, but I will try not to rush through him. China Miéville, and it's actually, his full name is China Thomas Miéville. China is the name his parents decided to give him after looking through a dictionary for an interesting, pretty kind of name. And he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He grew up in London. He's got a PhD in international law. He's written a book on Marxism and socialism. He was an avid fan of Dragons and Dungeons and Dragons growing up, and he loves John Harrison, Michael Moorcock, J.G. Ballard, and H.P. Lovecraft, and it shows through in his writing. The term New Weird gets associated with him. In fact, the term New Weird was actually coined by John Harrison in describing China Miéville back in the early part of the 21st century. And the New Weird, which Miéville is associated with, can be described as a combination of science fiction, fantasy, horror, some kind of strange H.P. Lovecraft in it as well. Somebody's described it as, it's like slipstream with a side of weird. Slipstream is where you combine genre together. And Miéville really came on the scene in 2000 with Perdido Street Station, which won lots of awards, got nominated for lots of awards. And just to show you the inventive strangeness of this novel, here is a picture of one of the main characters, Lynn. Lynn is the body of a human and the head of an insect. Lynn is an artist. Lynn eats different colored berries, digests them, and then secretes them out her butt in gelatinous form and creates sculptures out of them. Lynn is very endearing. She's a wonderful creature in this. She is the lover of the central character in Perdido Street Station, who is a mad scientist who engages in thaumatology science, magical science, and the main character is approached and they live in this, oh yeah, I should mention this. They live in this immense, thick, Victorian-like city on some alternate world called New Krubisan. And the mad scientist in this is approached by this being who comes from the desert, this winged being who has had his wings cut off and wants this mad scientist to give him flight again. And the man, I'm not giving you any more names because names just sort of get blurred together. This interesting scientist, Isaac, I'll say his first name, goes off studying flying creatures to try to understand flight, but his druggy friend who deals in dream shit, which is the popular drug in New Krubisan, gives the mad scientist this caterpillar that actually, it turns out, thrives on feeding it dream shit and grows into this slake moth, the giant moth with colorful wings that hypnotize its victims, and then it sucks the minds out of them. And so we follow this saga through this city that has creatures of all different bizarre fashions. We have cactus people and frog people. We have a giant spider. We have the insect people with the insect heads. We have a junkyard that self-organizes into an artificial intelligence. We have a drug dealer who has, well, how would I put it? Continually recombined his body into various perverse forms so that he ends up being this hodgepodge of different organs that Lynn has been forced into trying to make a sculpture out of. This novel is so filled with weird, strange things set in an alternate reality. In terms of imagination and intelligence and in literary quality, it is rich in vocabulary. It is intricate and deep in intelligence. That Perdido Street Station, in my mind, is the best science fiction novel that I've read for the 21st century. This is the best, in my mind. Okay, other people may list other ones, but I think Perdido Street Station clearly is the best of the first decade. And if you haven't read it, when people say, what would I read if I wanted to read science fiction? Perdido Street Station, along with Hyperion and a few others, I will always put up there, and Accelerando as well. But he was not to be outdone, and he continued to write a whole slew of really good novels, great novels, a lot of times. The Scar, which is a pirate science fiction novel about a floating city that is hundreds and hundreds of boats connected together. It is ruled by the lovers, a male and a female, who when they have sex, they scar their bodies. Told from the point of view of a woman who works in a library who's been captured by the pirates, with this really fascinating character called Uther Dahl, who is a combination of suave, reserved, refined, sophistication, and a murderous killer, a giant creature who pulls the city across the ocean, and an ending where they apparently are informed that they have already died, but don't believe it because they're still alive. It is a really good adventure novel. It is a very imaginative adventure novel. There are vampires in here. There are creatures from under the sea. There are combinations of the organic and the mechanical mixed together. It's another one of his novels of the strange, the weird, the different. It also takes place on the same planet that Perdido Street Station takes place on. He won Hugos and Nebulas and Locusts for The City in the City, which came out a few years later. Oh, a third one he wrote in the series with of the that took place on the same planet was Iron Console, which is about a train that moves across the desert that keeps the tracks keep getting rebuilt. I don't have time to talk about that one, but I'll talk about these last two, The City and the City, which is about a detective who is assigned a murder case in the city, but in fact, he lives in a city where there is a second city which overlaps with the first city, and the people in these two different cities are have been educated and trained and coerced into not seeing each other, even though they're standing right next to each other often, and the streets are right next to each other. And the mystery revolves around the fact that there may be a third city which is manipulating the goings on of the first two cities, which is somehow hidden somewhere in this one place. A lot of people really like this. I didn't particularly think it was as good as The Scar or Perdido Street Station, but it did win the Hugo and Nebulas, and they made it into a TV series. And finally, the last one, Embassy Town. Embassy Town is a strange novel among Mievel's strange novels. It is a cut above strangeness. The other one's Perdido Street Station, which is incredibly imaginatively strange and weird. He invents different kinds of strange characters, a strange environment. The whole city is something else. But Embassy Town is, in a sense, not as engaging, not as entertaining, but it's probably stranger. Imagine this world. It's populated by this species, the Areki. There's a picture of one. Areki, the hosts. They're very capable of biological manipulation engineering. The whole planet is alive, including all the furniture, architecture, everything. It's animated. Everything moves around and grows. The cities that the hosts live in grow. Humans exist in the middle of one of the Areki cities. The Arekis do not understand the concept of the lie. Their language involves a synthesis of their minds, the word, and the truth. Those three things which we can distinguish, they do not distinguish. When they communicate with dual sounds simultaneously emitted, and they don't recognize intelligence in any of the humans except for those humans that we have cloned as duals that can talk two simultaneous streams of thought at the same time. We end up making, inadvertently, the Areki addicted to a particular pairing of sounds which approximates a lie. And the whole population gets into this addiction of sound, the whole alien population. And Spanish Dancer, who was one of the Areki, turns out to be a kind of hero in this because the central human character eventually has to teach Spanish Dancer how to lie. And once they can understand the lie, they can understand the metaphor, and they can understand that their minds and reality and the world are three separate things, because before they weren't. It's very philosophical. It's a metaphor on the fall, because we have to teach the aliens how to sin, literally, how to lie. It gets into the whole issue of what is language, what is truth, what is identity. And it creates an alien species which is totally bizarre and different than us, with a totally different kind of mind. So, Embassy Town is a tough read, but philosophically, I think it's probably as deep as any of his novels, philosophically. I was quickly going to say at the end here, because I'm going to stop. I knew I ran over for 15 minutes. We're going to have another series of webinars, the second decade of the 21st century. And then I'm going to do some summary and conclusion stuff. But we're going to look at science fiction TV in the last decade, The Expanse and Black Mirror and Dark, The Handmaid's Tale, and the redo of Watchmen and The Man in the High Castle. This stuff came out in the last 10 years. If you've not watched Dark, watch Dark. Dark is very dark and strange, time travel. The Expanse is great space opera. Science fiction TV has evolved more so. Science fiction in the movies the last 10 years, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. There's more and more science fiction movies. And in fact, this last year, we finally had a science fiction movie which really took home the Oscars, Everything Everywhere All at Once. A decade ago, though, at the beginning of the last decade, we had this superb piece of cinematic orchestration, Cloud Atlas. If you've never seen Cloud Atlas, go watch it. Just a great movie, but lots of other very good movies of the last 10 years. They redid Planet of the Apes, did some more Mad Max, Ex Machina, which lots of people thought was great. They redid Blade Runner. Star Wars went into another whole series, Godzilla, some more Godzilla. The Avengers kept going, and other ones besides that I have up there. So there's a lot of science fiction cinema of the last 10 years as well. And then finally, talk about science fiction literature of the last 10 years or so, The Three-Body Problem, The Children of Time, the Annihilation, which is part of the Southern Reach trilogy, which is people have described as new weird too. We've had old science fiction writers that have kept writing. The Peripheral by Gibson, Ministry for the Future by Robinson, Stevenson's Seven Eves. The last couple of years, a noteworthy new science fiction writer has won the Hugo twice now, and the Nebula 2, Arkady Martini, A Memory Called Empire, and A Desolation Called Peace. And the short story level, Ted Chiang, who wrote this story for Arrival, has his stuff put into different collections. So we'll talk about the science fiction writers of the last 10 years as well, too. So that's it for today. I know I went way over, but I did get through it all. Okay. Ending with China Mia.